Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on a webinar organised by the Australian Airports Association. My name is Aaron Holloman, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Millennium Automation. And joining me today is Grant Jeffries from MedAires. The reason we're here today is to talk about, the learnings that we've had since COVID-19 and some of the technologies and processes we're seeing that are potentially going to be put into place, and some of the solutions that may evolve over time. I think we need to recognize that one of the key things we need to do as an industry is build confidence back into the traveling public. We're seeing a lot of media about how that's going to happen, and there's a lot of different discussions and a lot of different strategies. And one of the things we want to focus on is how technology can help and how process can help. I think that's an important thing, that this is a multimodal problem that we need to deal with. It's not just going to be solved by technology, it's also going to be solved by process, it's going to be solved by people. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we help ensure the safety of passengers and our colleagues that work at the airports and with airlines. One thing we are seeing is that there's a lot of debate happening by governments and authorities at the moment, but we think it's important that airports are prepared and are ready for whatever might end up being implemented, so effectively being future-proofed. Another thing we think is quite important is that we think beyond COVID-19. The fear around health risk and crisis is going to be beyond just COVID-19. I think we have a chance to learn from what's happened to make sure that if or when it happens again, that we're more prepared. We're also going to share some of the learnings we've had from other industries. An interesting effect of what's happened to our business during COVID-19 is we've had a lot of interest from outside aviation, and understanding the processes they're putting in place, understanding the technology they're looking in is something I guess we can take and potentially adapt to airports and airlines. So for those of you who don't know Millennium, I'll give you a bit of a background on us as a company. We are focused on passenger experience and seamless automation. That's the background of Millennium. We're a relatively new company. We're about 4 years old, and we're headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. We have over 50 airlines using our technologies globally. We're currently deployed in 13 airports and being implemented in an additional range of airports over the next 12 months. So we'll be in 21 airports shortly. And we have a range of solutions, both in terms of physical hardware, as well as self-service applications and operational software. And our aim is to make sure that we provide a seamless experience, not just for passengers, but also for airports. So technologies that are able to be deployed over the cloud, and we try to focus on making it as plug and play as possible. We're a team of around 80 people with a strong mix of talent, including data scientists, roboticists, software developers. We also have medical engineers in the business, which was, something that was fortunate considering the situation we see ourselves in at the moment. I'm going to be talking about two core technologies today. One is touchless control, and the other is vital sign detection. Now, when we talk about touchless control, we're talking about how do we make self-service touch points safe for passengers to use. So effectively, how do we stop them having to touch shared surfaces like a touchscreen or putting a passport into a passport reader? So the areas we're focusing on are head control, so the ability to create a virtual touchscreen, also voice recognition to control any device, whether it's a bag drop or a boarding gate with voice. Able to do touchless document reading, so read passports, again, without having to put it into a passport reader. Being able to take payments in a touchless way, biometrics, as well as doing virtual health conferencing. So the ability to actually speak with a medical professional if there's ever a concern at a touch point, rather than necessarily requiring frontline staff to come in direct contact with the passenger. So when we talk about head control, this is one of the technologies we want to focus in on today. It's the ability to create a virtual touch screen rather than a passenger having to touch a kiosk or a bag drop interface or boarding interface. Now, we do this using multiple technologies. The sensor array that we've developed has a multi-spectrum approach. So we look at both thermal, near-infrared, color cameras. There are also other sensing technologies in there to make sure that we can actually make everything entirely touchless. Now I'm going to show you a small video of how touchless control works. I think one thing that's important to highlight is that it doesn't actually require any specific integration to implement this other than installing the hardware. And that's because we create a virtual touchscreen driver. It practically works out of the box like any other touchscreen or traditional touchscreen where you would touch.
Touchless self-service is an important way to help protect users against viral and bacterial pathogens. One of the key technologies is head tracking, which effectively turns any screen into a virtual touchscreen. As you can see, I can look at the area of interest and select an icon. It even works in total darkness. I can continue to select the icons, yes and no. Applications of this include information kiosks, as well as devices or self-service devices that are in harsh lighting conditions.
Now, the original reason Alidium developed this technology wasn't because we were necessarily predicting COVID-19. We had actually developed it for passengers with reduced mobility. We had a number of meetings in Europe with European-based airports, and they were telling us that they had a concern that passengers with reduced mobility were deciding to use alternate modes of transport like trains because they didn't feel confident going through the airport using self-service because it wasn't accessible to them. So we'd been developing this technology for about 6 to 8 months prior to COVID rearing its head. But we believe that it's an adaptable technology that actually makes sense and provides confidence to the entire traveling public as well as passengers with reduced mobility. The next technology that we'd like to focus in on and talk about today is voice recognition. A question I quite often get around voice recognition is how does it work in a really loud environment like an airport? Alidium's been working in partnership with Amazon Web Services to develop a capability where you can use practical voice recognition in a loud environment. We do this with a mix of hardware and software approaches. So we actually use an array of unidirectional microphones and a camera system that actually triangulates where a passenger's mouth is relative to the microphones. Now, we only listen to the microphone that's most aligned with that passenger, and the other microphones in the array are used for background subtraction. The actual amount of noise that we can handle is up to 85 decibels worth of background noise. So that's the equivalent of having a tractor drive by while you're talking to the device. Now, I'm actually going to show another video that gives you examples of how the audio processing works. I will say that some of the audio is quite loud because it's got a lot of background noise, just something to keep in mind when it's playing.
The following audio clips are examples of how the Alidium Sensor array processes audio as an edge compute function prior to the submission to AWS voice recognition services. I would like to check in. Can I please change my seat? I would like an upgrade. I would like to change my seat. I would like to check in. I would like an upgrade. I would like to check in. Can I please change my seat? I would like an upgrade.
So as you would have seen from those clips, looking at the various stages of processing, we went from having a very noisy background where I was talking into the device all the way through to cleaning up all the audio so we could only hear the focused human voice rather than getting any sort of disruption. Now, I've got another video that actually shows this in practice in a loud environment, in a conference hall where we actually launched this capability with Amazon and with Etihad Airways. And you can see the practical application where I'm able to control a self-service touch point by talking to it without having to touch it in any way, shape, or form, and still have the full experience required to be able to check in or change my flight.
Hello, Mr. Hornleinen. Welcome to Etihad customer service. Unfortunately, due to bad weather, your flight has been delayed. Please say or tap on an alternate flight option.
Option 1, please.
Okay, great. We'll check you into flight EY2914. I've allocated you a window seat, 5F. Would you like to keep or change your seat?
Change my seat.
Okay, let's find you a new seat. Please say or tap on the seat number of your choice.
3A.
All right, you're booked into seat 3A. Thank you. Flight change complete. Your luggage has been forwarded to your new flight. Please make your way to gate 12.
In the next video, I'm going to show how we actually can use this mix of technology. So this mix of sensors, camera-based sensors, as well as microphones and other sensors to enable applications like even payment. So this is a video in Abu Dhabi airport with the payment being made for excess luggage, again, without having to touch any of the screen or interface, and it will work with any mobile device. So a person doesn't have to have a device with Apple Pay or Google Pay, though that is supported as well, but it can work with any sort of mobile phone. So the application of this is quite broad. We've focused in on some of them. So around being able to do touchless head control, voice recognition, and payments. But it's also able to do things like ID reading, so reading a passport in real time, and actually doing live time matching between the person standing there and their face and the actual photo on the passport. So it's quite a sophisticated a solution that can be implemented and really should drive an experience through the airport where a passenger doesn't need to touch any touch point and can feel confident and more safe. And we reduce the risk of the transmission of whether it's COVID-19 or any other infections that we may be worried about in the future. Changing tack slightly, I'd like to talk about vital sign detection. So vital sign detection is being spoken more broadly around external body temperature checks. But we believe that it's important to look at additional signals. So yes, body temperature is important, but so are vital signs like heart rate and respiratory rate. Now, the way that this technology works, again, is using the different sensors that we have integrated and the software that powers it. So to do things like temperature checks, we use a thermographic sensor, and I'll go into a bit more detail on how we get the accuracy to where it needs to be in future slides. But I'd like to explain how we do heart rate and respiratory rate now. So with heart rate, the way we can actually detect a person's pulse is by looking at their face, multiple points of interest on their face, so their forehead and their cheekbones, and we're able to actually detect the minute changes in light absorption as the heart pumps blood through the body and through the face. Now, when the heart does pump blood through the body and the face, you have a change in the amount of hemoglobin, oxygenated hemoglobin, and that reflects light differently. So it absorbs more light when you've got more hemoglobin than when you don't. And from that, we can effectively do signal processing and develop a wave formation to work out a person's pulse. A slightly different approach around respiratory rate. For respiratory rate, we're able to detect how fast somebody is breathing by looking at the change in temperature around their nasal passage. So as you breathe in cooler air, and as you breathe out warmer air. And from that, again, we're able to calculate how quickly somebody's breathing. So, the average range between kind of 12 to 25 breaths is considered roughly a healthy respiratory rate. If it's above and below, it may be an area of concern. One thing that I think is really important to note is that we're not suggesting this type of technology is a diagnostic technology. It's not going to say whether you have COVID or whether you have a specific illness. It effectively helps develop a risk profile for a passenger to understand whether they need to have a secondary screening by a medical professional, whether that be in person or through some sort of telehealth. And that's really how I guess the synergy between the type of approach we're suggesting and what MedAires is able to do really comes into play. When we talk about why vital signs are important beyond just doing a temperature check, heart rate, respiratory rate, and temperature are standard vital signs used in the medical industry for triaging symptoms. So that's something that's standard practice today. When you go to the doctor, you'll have a number of these vital signs checked, not just temperature. When we were actually looking into, I guess, comparative illnesses, respiratory illnesses like influenza and other ones, we wanted to understand, is just using temperature enough, or does having additional signals like respiratory and heart rate actually help create that risk profile more accurately? What we've been able to find a number of longitudinal studies that show that by having these additional vital signs as signals helps to create a profile for an individual and their potential to be ill. So in the example here, we show with influenza patients, there was a 93% correlation between having elevated respiratory rate, heart rate, and temperature, and them having influenza, compared to just 65% correlation if you just looked at temperature. And I think we've been seeing a number of articles in the media talking about, is temperature effective or not? We believe it is if it's accurately measured, but having the additional vital signs adds to the level of accuracy and robustness in terms of the data available to make decisions around whether a passenger is fit to fly or not. This video I'm going to show now really brings everything together. It shows somebody checking in on a common use kiosk. During the process of checking in, their temperature is detected to be elevated. They go through the rest of a vital signs detection, and then they speak to a medical professional. So as you can see in this video, Alejandro is now selecting the airline on a common use platform. He is now able to scan his passport. Done a live comparison to his face. We're now retrieving the booking. Now, this doesn't require the airline to do anything specific here. It's like using a normal passport reader through the CUS standard. We now have detected an elevated temperature, so it's now going to do additional checks. Now we're going to ask questions around their health.
No. Yes.
Hi, this is the survey. So we can complete your check-in. There are a few additional questions I would like to ask.
So there you go. That shows you a practical example of how this can be implemented. Now, this very specific implementation was around a check-in kiosk, but an important thing I think we should highlight is that because it's a background process, a passenger who wouldn't have an elevated temperature wouldn't necessarily go through the entire vital check sequence. And in that case, you wouldn't actually increase the overall processing time of a passenger. It's really based on building that risk profile of an individual and understanding whether they need to be looked at more closely, or even if they need to have a secondary screening. There are a number of issues around looking at a person's temperature in terms of accuracy when we're doing thermographic screening. So most of the solutions we're seeing out there are one-to-many solutions. So effectively looking at an entire scene of people and trying to detect in a group of 10, 20, or 30 people whether somebody has an elevated temperature. Now, with the resolution of a lot of the thermal cameras that are out there, that's quite a difficult thing to achieve accurately. So most of the solutions are looking at broad spectrum around a person's forehead or around elements of their face to see if they have an elevated body temperature. Environmental factors can actually impact whether you're able to detect that. So if you have people coming in from the up from the cold, swings in both ambient and transfer temperatures can really dramatically impact accuracy. And when I say dramatic, we can talk about a number of degrees in either direction. Now, when you're trying to make a determination between a healthy person being roughly 36.6 degrees Celsius versus someone who might have an elevated temperature of 37.4, having a swing of multiple degrees really can put it out of whack. The other thing that we think is worth highlighting is that a lot of solutions require the actual thermal scanning to be manned. Right, so it's not an automated process. So you end up having to increase the cost, not just in terms of having a solution, but then the actual operational cost of running that solution. And then finally, these type of implementations can also be quite difficult to manage from a process flow. So again, if you imagine you have a scene of people and you do happen to detect somebody with an elevated temperature, what's the next step? Do you pull them from out of the crowd? How do you isolate them? How do you manage them? If you do a one-to-one check where it might be at a kiosk or a bag drop or at a security gate, you have the ability to effectively pause the person's transaction and then manage them there and then actually work out what to do next with them. In terms of achieving accurate readings, and this is not necessarily specific just to our solution, but I guess is advice for any type of thermographic solution. One of the things we think is really important is around isolating passengers, so looking at a passenger one-to-one rather than one-to-many. This gives you the ability to target specific areas on a person's face, as well as look at areas at a higher resolution. So where we typically look at is, yes, we look across the entire forehead, but we also look at the temple and we look at the tear ducts. These are areas that give more accurate readings around a person's body temperature, external body temperature. Another thing we do is we actually detect using a different type of scanner, so not a thermal scanner. We actually look at the supraorbital blood vessels on a person's face and actually target those areas with the thermal camera, so we can actually target areas where we know blood is passing through rather than just looking at any area across the forehead. A good example is me. Whenever I use one of those contactless IR thermometers, like you can buy at a chemist, when I just do it at the center of my forehead, I actually typically get a low reading around 35 degrees. And yet when I do it near my temple or around the side of my face, I tend to get closer to my actual body temperature around that 36.6 degrees Celsius. The other thing that's really important with thermographic sensing is making sure you have a solution that does automatically adjust for drift. A lot of these thermal radiation sensors do suffer from a drift in their calibration. Now, this can actually happen over a period of hours or a period of weeks, depending on the quality of solution, but they all typically have some sort of drift. So having a solution that can automatically adjust for that means that you can actually maintain your accuracy rating. The other thing we think is really important is the ISO standard for febrile detection of body temperature. Now that actually describes how you manage things like drift, how you ensure that it meets a standard that can be used for detecting an elevated temperature, and also dictates that the uncertainty factor, so effectively the accuracy factor shouldn't be greater than 0.5 degrees. Another thing that we've had to do around ensuring accuracy of thermal scanning is managing the ambient and thermal temperature changes. So in our particular device, we have an ability to detect what is the external ambient temperature. We have an advanced thermal management system to make sure we do that and we don't have any impact from the heat generated by the camera device itself. Effectively, we're able to detect if there is a sudden change in temperature and we can auto-calibrate against that, or in extreme conditions, actually stop the process and say that we aren't certain of the environmental temperature, that we need to wait for a more stable environment, rather than being in a situation of having false readings, both positive and negative. To give you a bit of an idea of the type of device we're talking about, this is the Alidium Sensor array. Now, this enables all the functionality we have spoken about. So it has the thermal camera to be able to do temperature reading. It has multi-spectrum cameras to be able to do things like target blood vessels in the face, to be able to do head tracking control both during daytime and nighttime, as well as doing the full voice recognition and the targeting to make sure that we can remove all background noise. Now, this particular device, we haven't designed it to just run on Millennium solutions. We've designed it so it can work with any third party that wishes to implement it into whatever is in an airport or whatever is being installed in an airport. I think this was an important consideration in terms of both the ability to be flexible as well as have multiple form factors when Etihad decided to do a trial with both Millennium and MedAire around doing a touchless vital sign screening. An example of this is the head unit. This device here is the head unit that's going into the Etihad bag drop. And as you can see, the sensor array is integrated into the overall device. At a bag drop, again, this can be done at a kiosk, can be done at a security gate, can really be implemented in any touch point, even a check-in desk. A managed check-in desk where you might want to do touchless passport reading so that a passenger doesn't have to hand over their passport to an agent. The overall implementation that Etihad's putting in place, this is a render of their installation, so effectively creating an entirely touchless environment. They are putting in barriers, so they do have to have a staff member involved. They are behind it. And again here, it's touchless as well as doing vital sign screening. And then integrated into MedAire, if there is a person that's considered at risk, making sure that it's an appropriate process to manage that passenger and decide whether they are fit to fly or not. From a workflow perspective, an example workflow is what we're showing here on the screen, where effectively you can, along the entire journey of a passenger through the airport, you can use the various technologies and processes. So before the airport, you may ask passengers to upload, health passports, any certifications around their health, as well as ask them a health questionnaire like a capability provided by MedAire, and actually record that before they even get to the airport. Then at the airport, you can do vital sign screening to make sure they're not showing any current symptoms like a fever, elevated heart rate, or respiratory rate. And again, do, I guess, a deeper analysis of whether that person, where they stack in terms of a risk profile. And then if they are showing symptoms, allow secondary screening or for the passenger to talk to a medical professional. In the air, now this is something where from an Millennium perspective, we don't necessarily provide a solution, but from an overall end-to-end solution perspective, needs to be taken into account. And this is another area where MedAire can become involved in actually helping in the air, if the passenger becomes sick, actually managing that situation and understanding what makes sense to do for that passenger, and also ensuring the health and safety of other passengers on board the aircraft. And then finally, the onward journey. And then this is really about making sure that airports and airlines are staying in contact with their passengers in case they do get sick later on in the journey, so that we can manage it in terms of a return journey. Are they fit to fly and return home? What if they're sick and yet they have visa issues, or they need to leave by a certain time? It's really important that we look at this from a holistic perspective. So thank you very much for your time while I've described, I guess, the approaches that Millennium has been looking at. I'd now like to hand it over from MedAire, and he can explain who MedAire are and really the impressive capability and experience they have with helping airports and airlines through, I guess, a very difficult time.
Okay, thanks very much, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us to learn a little bit about our companies and how we're trying to help respond to the current situation. So this afternoon, I'll cover in the balance of the session a little bit about who MedAire is, and then focus definitely around the current crisis and our role and how we'd like to work with the industry to return to travel, get things back to a state of the new normal, and how we can do that by leveraging technology, innovation, as well as providing a robust infrastructure around it. So firstly, a bit about MedAire. My role is the global president of the company. We are in the business of looking after all aspects of aviation from a medical and security standpoint. We are the leading provider of in-flight, pre-flight passenger and crew medical support, and we do that at both ends as well as in flight or around a journey. And we do this by providing access for the industry to our medical and security expertise, as well as content and information that we package into education that can be delivered online or in person in training, as well as by providing medical equipment to airlines, as well as business and general aviation operators, so that they're able to provide the necessary protection to their crew to operate safely. In order to do this, we're a global operation. We have been around for over 30 years. We're definitely servicing the majority of all the leading airlines, as well as the business aviation market. We have that are available for our customers to call into. And at the other end, you will find emergency room doctors, flight nurses, as well as security experts. And we're there to provide a response to a situation. For today's session, we're talking about a medical situation, and hence we're focusing in on the doctors and nurses. We take a lot of calls all over the world in all languages, and we have a presence as part of the broader International SOS group. We have a presence in over 90 countries, and we're able to sustain, during the peak of travel, we would support well over 1 million calls per year from flights or on the ground, people looking for escalation around how to handle a certain medical situation. If we talk now about the current situation and what we're referring to here as a new norm, I think for those that have been through perhaps 9/11 is one of the best benchmarks, where we really never returned to the pre-existing norm. This was a security trigger. However, it did absolutely bring the industry to its knees, and we had to learn how to operate safely in a new environment. Now, today we're talking about a global pandemic, and this is not the first one, won't be the last. We've certainly worked through a number in the last 30 years of pandemics of different levels. And with each one, you have to respond. Our role is to work with the airport authorities, the regulators, as well as the airlines, to understand how to continue operation. And we always do it with a lens around how to look after the staff on the ground, the crew and passengers, and how to do it and help the industry meet the various legal and compliance obligations that will permeate out of a situation like this. And then to obviously focus on, which gets to the heart of what Aaron discussed, around how to try and verify that we are transporting passengers that are deemed fit to travel or fit to fly, and the same with the crew. So obviously in the airport environment, the focus of today, we're seeing daily now the change in requirements coming out, the various different perspectives countries and even cities are taking against what the rules are. And obviously some of the ones that are becoming more consistent around social distancing, as well as requiring health checks, and in the future looking at introducing concept of immunity or with a vaccine. It will be a health passport concept, which is not new either. Vaccination records have been around for hundreds of years. So I think we're going to expect many of these, and I think this list is not exhaustive. I think the final bullet here is the one that we're all looking to address, which is how can we accomplish the above, which is create a safe environment to operate in our industry, but also how do we try to minimize delays, waiting times, and obviously burdening the industry with additional cost. And I think that is also very topical in the current media. So if we look at that and we talk about MedAires' approach and how we're looking to work with partners to do it, it really is about restoring confidence to not only the passengers, but it's the employees of the airlines, it's the employees that work at the airports, and the general community at large. How do we give them confidence that travel in our market is okay? To do that, obviously, a lot of people are working together and working very quickly, but it does come from compliance, regulation, and guidelines about what we could call safe, what it means. It also talks about the ability to provide an infrastructure with the lens of how to provide expertise when it's needed, at what point during the process of operations, so that this is safe. I think already today we are seeing ICAO, the international authority, trying to bring together the airlines, airport, regulator, and governments to try and learn from 9/11 and get out of the gate with a relatively consistent standard across the industry, which will obviously help everyone gear up and scale and implement. We do see and did see with 9/11 very inconsistent approach globally, which even today does lead to difficulty trying to manage flights with airlines and certain city pairs. So definitely concerted effort is underway globally, and our part here is we participate with ICAO, working with our medical directors to try and provide guidance on workable procedures around how to check, what to do in certain situations, how to identify the risks. And I think for this particular situation, medical intervention is very important. Being able to provide it in a scaled and cost-effective fashion is also very important. And it is not just around the aircraft. It is very much about the airport staff being able to adjudicate around being ready to work and ready to travel. So the restoring confidence is going to be key. Doing it with visible initiatives. What brings confidence to the community is when they are visibly able to identify with how we're taking care, how we're looking after the risk, and how we're helping to manage it. So there's a number of opportunities, and we are currently, obviously flights are going on now, we are currently working with airports and airlines to deliver those visible enhancements to the screening process. The screening process itself is not new. We adjudicate every day on passengers, whether they're fit to fly. We are looking for, and the gate agents are trained to identify with certain things, whether it is a health issue, security issue, etc. Very well drilled process with many, many years of honing. What we need to do now is supplement that process so that it takes into account the current risks and use whatever compliance and screening procedures that are deemed appropriate by the authorities, introduce that into the process so that the operation can absorb and industrialize it and move forward. So here you can see we provide nurses on the ground. There are different touch points Aaron referred to, which center around at the check-in. It could be curbside. Then you have security. Internationally, you'll have immigration. A lot of different touch points where you're able to conduct levels of screening. What we do then is provide the next layer. So you can have physical, medical personnel present. You can have technology providing the screening. And then we provide the hotline for the airport staff, agents, security, to contact us and talk through the results of whatever the process is and protocol. And based on that, there's a recommendation given to the authorities on whether or not it's safe to proceed, in this case with a passenger or crew member flying. So that's the role, and our infrastructure is designed to adopt and implement these standards as they change and evolve. In addition, we're able to provide personal protection equipment. We already provide medical kits to many airlines for onboard use and pre-flight use. Now we have to enhance that medical equipment so that as certain things are going to be far more prevalent, we'd need to enhance the kits and ensure that everything is available to meet the standards. And if you're watching the media closely, you'll realize there is not a consistent level of acceptance of what is the appropriate use of PPE, specifically around masks. So as that evolves, we have a need to meet the requirements, and they can be inconsistent or relevant by country, by airport, but our job is to make that equipment available. Then we wrap it all up into our digital training, and particularly today, it's very important to be able to respond quickly. So the ability to retrain as the requirements change and evolve and the situation evolves is where we really are working hard with our clients and with the industry so that we have relevant, up-to-date training to provide the appropriate risk and management methods. Beyond that, there are tools that can be brought to the table. One specific one that is being used within aviation, but also by several hundred corporate businesses globally, is having a pandemic tool that has all the information at one central location. What is the latest on the COVID virus? Where is it in relation to your airports, your buildings? You can have it's a business continuity and crisis management tool, so it gives you the ability to have playbooks in place, a resource library, predetermined actions to trigger in the event of a situation at the airport. For example, an employee is test positive. What do you do? How do you respond? Who do you have to communicate with? And who do you need to notify? So this tool is readily available and is very good tool to help make sure your planning is appropriate, and also to help you conduct the necessary exercise and drills. It does have significantly more plans in place around all sorts of pandemics beyond COVID, as well as security events, natural disasters, etc., and very much worth using to try and organise your pandemic response, but also your broader business continuity. So if we move on to beyond the operation into technology and innovation, I think there's quite a number of opportunities for managers of airports, managers of employees that work at airports, as well as the airlines themselves, in terms of how to try to cover as many opportunities as possible to manage risk. A couple of areas that we have been focusing on building around a workflow is focusing on how we can ensure passengers and staff are able to either board or return to work. And this happens before they leave their home or their hotel. So the first one, focusing in on staff, is providing a compliance and monitoring tool that gives a manager ready visibility into their staff and their status. Are the staff available to be rostered to go to work today? Are they in isolation? Have they had contact with someone? They have to prepare a declaration, and it gives the airport managers, in this case, the ability to know who's available and who's not available. Same with the airlines. It's again used more broadly around the corporate space, but it is designed to go through a health questionnaire. The health questionnaire changes as the situation changes around what to ask, what the rules are, as well as what the isolation period is. But the manager has a dashboard then of who's available and who's not. and when they will become available. Very useful for managers trying to keep track of where their staff are at, particularly those that have been put at home in isolation. So naturally, for crew, a very critical management tool to be able to be used. But then if you take that exact same context into the passenger space, the exact same protocol applies, obviously differently in terms of why we're doing it, but we definitely would prefer passengers that can't self-declare, can't pass a health questionnaire, that they would obviously not present at the airport. And so you can give them an opportunity at home to complete a pre-travel questionnaire. They can then come equipped with what we would call a fly safe advice, but it's effectively this concept of being not vulnerable, haven't had contact, et cetera, and ultimately this will build out into concepts around pre-testing or immunity or vaccination. And then you get into what Aaron described, which are the various checkpoints at the airport where we go through and we augment technology, screening the passengers, which Millennium would provide, with the escalation to our doctors and nurses to understand what the risks presented were, and we can then provide recommendations as to whether or not to allow the passenger to continue through. In flight, we provide in-flight medical assistance and support. So if a person does present symptoms in flight, as many do today, for whatever type of medical incidents, we are there to provide advice to the captain as to whether or not we need to potentially divert the aircraft. Can we continue safely? What measures should we provide a first responder medical support in order to make the passenger as comfortable as possible until we reach medical care on the ground, which we then coordinate. And then post-flight, you obviously have, depending on the country and your experience, you will have restrictions, obligations around self-monitoring that need to be taken care of. So our job is the continuum of monitoring augmented with the medical infrastructure, leveraging whatever technology is available in order to make the best possible risk assessment and recommendation. In terms of how we do that, I think the Millennium technology, which moves to touchless, obviously the pilot we're doing with Edia is going to be very much telling in terms of how we're industrializing the use of vital signs to give the medical staff the best possible information to make a decision. This augmented with then secondary screening where appropriate, and you can see how this will greatly assist the airport authorities and the airlines meeting their duty of care obligations. And obviously the legal compliance is starting to come out now with who's responsible, who's liable, and clearly we want to be in a position to help companies meet their duty of care, meet their obligations, and minimize that profile as well. So I think in conclusion, I'd like to perhaps wrap it up into where the situation is today, but I think talk more about the journey. The number one objective is to resume airline operations. This industry is very important to all of us, and to do so, it's creating an infrastructure and operational procedures and capability that we are going to continue to adapt as the situation unfolds and as technology, the medical treatment and advice, the compliance and regulation, as they also continue, we will adapt to it and provide these solutions to airports and airlines so that we do ultimately provide continuity of travel, which is our number one objective. I think in doing so, the continual evolution of the technology, and I think what Aaron showed is some fascinating use of vital signs to really help highlight risks beyond a simple temperature check. And I think us leveraging that with medical expertise is going to help significantly in the coming weeks and months. But ultimately, we're doing so with a view that we have to be cost conscious. I think as many of these initiatives, and we saw in the news overnight, where there's even a difference on spacing in flight, whether you leave a seat or not. In reality, we have to be cost conscious so that what we place on the industry in terms of additional regulations, additional process and procedures, we need to make them as affordable as possible while meeting, obviously, the compliance and regulation requirements. So I think for that last piece, it is definitely the lens we're working through with all of the innovation that we're doing, as we hope to return to what is the new norm as quickly as we can, and keep our industry going. So with that, I think we have some time now for some questions in the balance of the hour. So at this point, I'd like to open it up. Please share any questions that you may have.
So I believe the first question is for me around the head control. Is it eye-based or is it the actual movement of the head? So we looked at a number of approaches. So we tried actually doing hand-based gestures as well as eye control. We actually ended up landing on head control. We did tests with a number of individuals, both passengers who have reduced mobility, so were in wheelchairs or walkers. And what we actually found was they were able to better control the virtual cursor using head tracking. The actual movement of the head is very minute. So you're talking about really millimeters in each direction. It doesn't really require you to make any significant movement. It's also designed to be adaptive to the type of movements you make. So it's all about being relative. If you suddenly do larger movements, it won't go violently across the screen. It'll adapt to the type of changes you're making. But really, it is quite an easy technology to use. There's no real learning curve. The testing we've been doing have been on uneducated users. So by that we mean we actually ask them to go up to the kiosk and see if they can understand from from standstill whether they know how to use it based on the instructions, start using it rather than being told use this kiosk using head tracking. There's a second question here for me, I believe, from Perth Airport. In addition to existing Alidium CUS products, we are installing the Alidium CUS product into Airport now. How easily can it be implemented? It can be implemented quite easily. So we understand that whatever solution we put in place needs to be easy to implement and doesn't really require any sort of heavy customization. So from a hardware perspective, it can be easily mounted on the top of one of our kiosks or bag drops. It can also be mounted onto any third-party device. So it's a kiosk built by another manufacturer or another vendor. From an integration point of view, with the CUS platform, we try to make all the functionality as closely as we can to the CUS standard. So the ability to read a passport using the Alidium Sensor array presents itself as if it were a traditional passport reader to a CUS platform. The ability to do head control effectively emulates a touch screen. So again, it's really Windows-based drivers. We really do try to minimize the integration work required. Another question on vital sign detection. The question is, how does a passenger racing into the airport late, how are they processed? Could there be a false positive? So the answer to that question is yes, there could potentially be a false positive. Both somebody running late as well as environmental factors can impact vital sign detection. So if you're coming out of a very warm or cold environment, as well as if you are running to a device and your heart rate's high and your respiratory rate's high. A number of things we've considered in regard to that. One is we would expect, just like what happened after 9/11, when there was a process saying you need to come to the airport earlier, at least in the initial stages, as airlines, passengers, airports are getting used to this process, passengers would be asked to come earlier and make sure they're not basically rushing themselves through the airport. The other thing is the ability to do that teleconference call with a medical professional. So if it's a case somebody's running late to a flight, they've gone to check in, and they're showing elevated vitals, whatever those vitals may be, there is then that virtual teleconference where a medical professional can actually have a discussion and ask what's happening. The passenger can say, oh, I'm running late to my flight. I actually feel perfectly fine. And then it's up to the medical professional to then decide whether there needs to be a secondary screening or not. Practically speaking as well, things like check-in, they typically close 20 to 30 minutes before the flight. So you would think that a passenger isn't necessarily running to the kiosk. And if there are, they probably need to go to a service desk anyway. I have another question here on the voice recognition and the languages that it supports. So at the moment, we can support up to 120 languages, though there are 7 languages that we have specifically, I guess, tuned for an airport environment. Languages including, obviously, English and various dialects of English, Spanish, German, French, Arabic, and a number of others. It can also automatically detect language, so you don't have to select in any sort of way that you need to speak English or something. You can start talking and it'll pick up the language that you're talking in. Another question that I can see on the screen here is around the intent of screening ground staff and other staff members. Yes, I think it does make sense to also screen not just passengers, but also staff members. Grant spoke about the fact that we need to worry about the health and safety of passengers, but also our colleagues that work in the airlines and airports across the entire spectrum. We're shortly about to do a rollout into an airport in the United States, where the first use case is actually doing vital sign detection on staff members. Okay, I don't think there are any other questions coming through at the moment, so I'd like to finish off by thanking everyone that's joined us today. Hopefully you found the information useful. Please feel free to reach out to both myself as well as Grant about any questions you might have, as well as any feedback you might have about what you're seeing being rolled out at airports, both in Australia and internationally. I think I can speak for both Millennium and in this case also MedAires, saying that this is we understand that this is a difficult time and that it's going to be dynamic in terms of what's actually rolled out. So having these conversations, I think, is quite important and hopefully useful for everyone involved. So again, thank you very much for your time today. And I'd also like to thank again the Australian Airports Association for organising and facilitating this.
Thanks, everyone.